Thank you all for coming to, I guess we should say, to mourn Bruce's retirement after a mere 43 years, uh, but also to celebrate really his really quite wonderful career as both a scholar, teacher, and of course, one of our colleagues. Uh, I think it's particularly fitting, actually, that this take place in the politics and history workshop. Because of its history, actually. Um, Bruce and I actually started the workshop, and Bruce should get more of the credit than I did. For one particular reason, he named it among many things. And when we started it was basically the two of us and a third person who came from out of town who just happened to be here. And then Patty and Cheng were hired, and so we included them. So we had, for quite a long time, a massive number of 5 people in this workshop. But I think in some ways, both the title and its aim was essentially a kind of aspiration for a department that we wanted it, an aspiration for what we wanted the department to really be at that time. And I won't go into the reasons why we had this aspiration, other than to say that there were certain people in the department long since gone who were trying to turn it into a very different version of, which probably Victor remembers, of pure professional, a purely professional quantitative department with everybody else purged of the from the place. But so we set this up as a forum basically for sharing diverse scholarly work, basically which was devoted basically to the big questions of politics and the big questions of history. And it was a place where those kinds of questions could be addressed. And in the meantime, I guess one really can say that the department became very much what the aspiration of the workshop was meant to be, and became kind of a forum for sharing many big projects in a very modest setting. And in many ways, Bruce's work, and Bruce as a person really represents everything that that title was supposed to be. Um, so, so what I would like to talk about, just in introducing him, is my own sense of both my own sense of loss at seeing him retire, and two kind of, I guess, two observations, one personal and the other a little bit more, both personal and scholarly. Okay, the personal one, and some of you know this story a little bit. He was a fairly well-known teaching assistant when I was an undergraduate at Berkeley. In those days, he wore a kind of military jacket, had kind of long hair, jeans, and looked very much the 1960s radical that we all aspired to be. And everybody, I should also mention the fact that all the graduate students around him, some of whom I did know, even though I was just a 20-year-old who happened to land in Berkeley, also not only looked the same, but I remember thinking of them as incredibly sophisticated people, really in the know. They all hung around the top floor, Bruce will appreciate this, of Barrows Hall in this place, and said all sorts of clever things, at least things that were clever to me at the age of 20, and seemed to have read everything under the sun. And so he was part of that backdrop, but I didn't really know him. And the reason our paths didn't really cross has to do with the fact that he was a TA for somebody who everybody warned me not to take, Nelson Polsby. And the reason, in fact, why probably our paths never crossed was I'd been told not to take the class for which he was a TA. Everybody said it was a horrible introduction to American politics, and take anybody else. So if I hadn't followed that advice, I'm sure I would have known him already from that point on. But one of the advantages of having him as a colleague has been that because he was one of the older people relative to my 20-year-old self, but it turns out not that much older. I have to admit nowadays. I could always feel when he was in the department that I was at least one of the younger people, even though as the years went by, I certainly wasn't any longer one of the younger people. I mean, and now that he's leaving, it makes me really feel like I've lost a very important part of my youth. And unfortunately, I'm going to become one of the older people, even in my own self-conception. So in that respect, I feel personally very aggrieved that he's leaving. But also, there's a sort of personal scholarly reason for why I sort of regret that he's leaving, but also obviously not really. And that is that for just years and years, I've had the pleasure of discussing with him just about at least half the things that he's written while I was here over coffee. And I've heard most of the work as it was progressing. And we've always had a certain kind of conversation that I assume will continue on, but it was nice to have also within the academic setting. And that was basically, we had almost a scripted conversation. He would tell me about something he was working on, and I would say, well, there's a larger theory behind it, and you may want to think about this conceptual structure behind it. At which point he would always answer me, and you have to understand, he is a lapsed theorist. He was once a theorist, in fact, a student of Sheldon Wolins. So this becomes particularly pointed. He would always say to me, but that's not very historical, or that lacks historical context. At which point I would always generally say something like this: well, some of the greatest theorists wrote distorted views of history. And I would, of course, trot out Marx on Birmingham, and trot out Polanyi, who was wrong about Speen-Hamlin, and also Weber, who was wrong about Protestant. And so it's all the great theorists were also in some ways violated his canons of history, of historicism. And so we go back and forth on this. So I don't know, except for one case, which I know where he actually did take some of my conceptual advice, but I always came out of those conversations, I can say, and this talking to him, and I think others of them have had the same experience of essentially learning something that I hadn't known before. Because one of the advantages that he reads so much overall was that he always told me something in opposition to what I was saying that I just simply hadn't known. So I think many of us have had this experience with him, where he will simply bring up something and you'll say, I don't know if I agree or disagree, but I do know that this is something I should have known, but don't. And this has happened time and again with conversations with him. And it's that I think all of us are going to miss in some ways in the department, among the many other things that we will miss. And what I think we'll also miss in some ways is that he has been just a very sort of reflective and wise person to have around, both when we had problems to solve in the department, and I think just also as somebody who always had something interesting to say about scholarly things, even if it wasn't his field. And I think, he has been in some sense a mainstay of the department, someone you could always rely upon, both for his judgment and also for a certain kind of just integral sense of decency, which is just hard to find in the academic world. Not in our department, fortunately, but go in the rest of academia and you'll find a lot of people who take themselves much too seriously. So, and he's one of those people, I think, who just takes himself very seriously, but I think has always been just sort of a person of just incredible, just not only academic accomplishment, but real integrity. So that's really all I have to say about him. I could say a lot more actually, but I'll stop there. And I'm going to turn things over to Julie, who will say a few more words, and then we'll turn things over to him, and he can hold forth both about his career, his work, and the article which he had assigned for us to read.
Thanks,
so Julie,
Peter.
Please take it away.
We actually didn't consult at all in advance, but as you'll see, we're touching on a lot of the same themes. So in the parlance of political science, we have intercoded reliability. Bruce is, of course, known as a scholar and a leader in the field. He is a foundational figure in the modern study of the presidency, with a long track record of producing these deeply researched, historically rich accounts that always attend very carefully to context. But while the history itself is superb, the work also builds important theoretical accounts about presidential leadership and when and how it works. We've all learned so much about this from reading Bruce's work and from having him around. To all of this, he brings also a deep sensibility about the deferred American dreams of justice, and his thoughtful and inspiring defense of full-throated liberalism is a consistent hallmark in his work. He contributed energy and expertise to the Presidency Research Group, ultimately the section in APSA, and has served Presidential Studies Quarterly extensively for years. And of course, he's a founder and long-term member of this workshop, offering his ideas and expertise to generations of colleagues who've benefited. In fact, when I interviewed for my position at Albany, the Politics and History workshop was pitched to me as a selling point, and obviously it was effective. Many of us have seen projects that gestated in this space move out into the field, carrying with them the broad and curious sensibilities of this group, which I think is a real value in political science. But when I reflect on Bruce and his career, the one adjective that really captures it most for me is not his brilliance, but his generosity. Let's just take one example. He published his first book review in 1977. Book reviews are not a terribly valued publication in political science. They primarily benefit the author of the book by giving that book more visibility. Bruce has published 30 book reviews over the course of his career while maintaining a very energetic publication record alongside that. Bruce is an amazing mentor. He has mentored and helped his graduate students, generations of graduate students in the classroom, through his design and management of 101. He's chaired 8 dissertations to successful conclusions, and he has served on countless other graduate student committees, including dissertation committees. And having served with him, I can testify that he is a kind and intellectually generous member of committees. But also, he has done a lot of quiet work behind the scenes with his colleagues. He's mentored junior faculty, helping junior faculty get through the process of getting to tenure, helping them figure out what happens after tenure and how you move through the associate stage and continue to generate fresh new ideas and develop them. And he's also recognized that even when you become a senior faculty member in the field, there's still room for mentoring and help. No new chair could possibly have asked for a better or kinder mentor. And he's also done a lot of generous work in broader education. He's offered more than a dozen courses at the Humanities Institute for Lifelong Learning, and he's been so generous in sharing his expertise every electoral cycle with our students, with the university community, and with the broader community. He is one of the first places people turn to understand what is happening, whether it's something that's got everybody excited and happy or terrified. He is always there to share his wisdom with us and to put the current moment into a broader context in a way that we can understand. So we can all readily recognize Bruce's external stature. He's very visible, he's well known, he's a deservedly celebrated figure in the field of American politics. But those of us who've been here at Albany have all been so fortunate to have a colleague who is as generous as he is brilliant. Thank you, Bruce, for all of your contributions, both visible and invisible, to the intellectual life of the department and the surrounding community.
Okay, so Bruce, why don't you take it away?
Okay. Well, first of all, are some thanks. Thanks most of all to Peter, who came up with the idea for this session. Peter is a dear friend of long standing. And one of the things that makes retirement easier is that I know that our conversations over coffee, particularly when we can go live again to Perfect Blend in Del Mar, will continue. Thanks to Julie, too, for those very kind comments. And I must say that having been in the department for 43 years, and this is not to cast aspersions on anyone else, but Julie is the finest chair I think this department has had, at least in my 43 years. And I must say, a far better chair than I ever was. Thanks also to Stefan for arranging this session, and thanks to everyone else for coming. I realize that on a rainy day, people don't have much else to do than go on Zoom, but nonetheless, I'm happy that all of you showed up. So, Machiavelli famously said that fortune is the arbiter of half of our affairs, but that we still have command over the other half, or almost the other half. And that turns out to be a pretty good framework for my reflections on my own career, which I really think, going back in ways that I don't think I've ever done before, really does suggest about how much I actually chose of my career and how much came to me unintended from the initiatives of others, and often out of the blue. I'm going to start with the half that involves my own choices. And when I reflect back, it's pretty obvious to me that the roots of my academic career lay in Berkeley, in the University of California at Berkeley, and in the city and its politics. It was really in Berkeley where I was an undergraduate starting in 1962 and finished my doctoral dissertation and departed in 1974. It was there that my fundamental academic interests, my personal commitments, and my values were essentially shaped. Berkeley was, in the 1960s, a place where ideas and political action were closely intertwined. One quick illustration. I remember a conversation with a fellow graduate student, Jim Glass, who happens to be a friend of Mort's. Conversation about Plato. As we stood outside a building on the Berkeley campus, occupied by protesting students, and waited for the police to arrive. That was Berkeley in the 1960s. Plato seemed very relevant, as did much of the rest of the political theory, to the political crises and political strategies of the moment. As to ideas, the ideas that shaped my thinking, coming to Berkeley as a pretty naive 17-year-old, were primarily shaped by four eminent political theorists who were my teachers: Sheldon Wolin, John Schaar, Norman Jacobson, and Michael Rogan. Rogan being eventually my dissertation chair. And I primarily focused on political theory as an undergraduate, and political theory was my major field as a graduate student. I took far more courses, particularly courses with Wolin, in political theory than I took in American politics. I was not an Americanist, but when the time came to choose a dissertation topic, I realized that what I most wanted to do was not to write a theory dissertation. This was the late 1960s. a time of profound crisis in American life. The peak of the Vietnam War, a country whose cities in particular ravaged by racial conflict, when America seemed to be falling apart, and also, of course, the terrible time of assassination, particularly the assassination of Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King. And so I decided what I really wanted to understand was what had gone wrong about this country. Rather than looking at that moment, at say President Johnson or the war, I wanted to look back to a brighter time when the country seemed to be on the right track, but when I suspected that the seeds of the present disasters might be unearthed. That took me to a dissertation topic on the presidency of John F. Kennedy. And contrary to what I would write about later as the myth that everything had been great under Kennedy and had gone wrong only because he had been killed in Dallas in 1963, that the roots of the disasters lay in Kennedy's presidency and, to be fair, before that. And the Kennedy dissertation became, a bit later, my first book. But when I went on the job market with a dissertation on President Kennedy, willy-nilly, I was no longer a political theorist. Now, by definition, I was an Americanist, qualified to apply for jobs in American politics with a specialty on the presidency. And so the choice of a dissertation, in a way, determined the rest of my academic career. However, I'm happy to say that I did not ever really leave theory behind, in two senses. First of all, I was able to hold on to my background and fascination with American political theory, which I had studied with John Schaar, Norman Jacobson, and Michael Rogan. So in my first tenure-track job at the University of Texas at Austin, I was able, after 2 years, turning out to be the retirement of the man that controlled the American political theory course, I was able to teach American political theory. And ever since I came to Albany, I've taught American political theory, first as an undergraduate course, and then leaving that to Mort as one of my 3 graduate seminars in a regular 3-year rotation. I've also written and published a number of journal articles and book chapters on American political theory, and I still review pieces and books in that area. Second, and probably more integral to my career, my background in theory and my fascination with political theory very much shaped how I've approached the presidency. And that made me different than almost everybody else in the subfield of presidency studies. Most people came from a background in behavioral analysis, in public administration, in the study of presidents and Congress. Very few brought a political theory training to the study of the presidency. And I think you can see very quickly some of that in the Spectacle article that Peter sent out. So I had a different sensibility, a different set of reference points, a different set of conceptual issues as a person trained in theory as a graduate student than most of my colleagues in the field of presidency studies. My work has always pretty much reflected that. Although if there's time, I'll mention that I was delighted to see that a very prominent rational choice theorist has done experimental work on presidents and the public that turned out to provide more support to my spectral work than to the other leading approaches to that subject. So I at least received some kind of empirical confirmation, again, out of the blue. So that tells you something about where my career began and where it came from and what shaped it. But Berkeley was also critical for my political education and my political immersion, in a sense, my political baptism. It was not only that Berkeley in the 60s was a political hotbed. That's pretty common understanding. In fact, as I look back, almost every year, politics roiled the campus. There was one year, for example, when Berkeley had a quarter system, where the TA union, of which I was a member, went on strike every single quarter for a different cause, 3 different causes in 3 quarters. And of course, that meant we shut down the discussion sections, first moving them off campus, and then when people said that's not really a strike, shutting them down altogether. The professors, fortunately, were extraordinarily forgiving of our trespasses against their courses. But along with all the turmoil at Berkeley, 2 social movements were the most important formative experiences of my politics, and ones that deeply inform everything I've done as a scholar. The first was the free speech movement at Berkeley in 1964. And that was, if you know your history of the 60s, the first major campus rebellion and the kind of prototype of what roiled American campuses for the next decade. Second, and even more important, was the civil rights movement. When I went home after my freshman year in college, it was the summer of 1963, and I was profoundly moved by the March on Washington and by Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And I said to myself, when I go back to campus in the next couple of weeks, I'm going to join the civil rights movement, which I did. I joined a campus chapter of CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, one of the major national civil rights organizations. And as part of CORE, I took part with other organized groups in a number of protests in the San Francisco Bay Area, in Berkeley and Oakland and San Francisco. And in fact, at the age of 20, went limp and was carried out police and arrested in a sit-in on Auto Row in San Francisco. And by the way, got 6 months probation, which sort of kept me from getting arrested during the free speech movement, much to my regret, because that had produced the largest academic sit-in, I think, in the entire history of the 60s. Secondly, at the age of 20, after my junior year in college, I spent the summer of 1965, the voting rights summer, doing voter registration work in rural South Carolina, working for a project of SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And if you're not familiar with SCLC, it was the organization led by Martin Luther King Jr. And in fact, in our orientation in Atlanta, I got to meet King and to hear him speak to our group, which is one of the unforgettable experiences of my life. And that summer probably was the most profound personal experience in my political education. And I, in fact, wrote about it in the preface to my second book. It gave me a kind of experience of grassroots democracy unlike any other. It really was kind of, and became the core of my political faith, a faith that transcends experience and becomes a part of one's soul. So Those were the sort of twin pillars of my education at Berkeley. Intellectual education, political education, the two very much intertwined, and pretty much shaped what I would do for the rest of my career. My second book, Icons of Democracy, was a post-tenure book. By that I mean that while I had done some preliminary work, I really did not deeply engage in it until I got tenure. To get tenure, in addition to publishing a book, I published, I forget, 6 or 7 articles in book chapters. But the project that I planned, a large, sprawling investigation of American political leadership from the founding to the present, was such a massive undertaking that I knew I would need tenure to pull it off. It is, I think, the glory of tenure that it allows projects like that. Icons of Democracy was in the making for 10 years. I spent an average of a year apiece on 9 different iconic figures in American political leadership, starting with Alexander Hamilton and ending with Martin Luther King. It was a glorious project. I got to read in almost their entirety the papers of figures from Alexander Hamilton through Abraham Lincoln to Eugene V. Debs and Franklin Roosevelt and a number of others. It was a great project, and I finally was published about 10 years after I had begun. And like much else in my career, had a peculiar, complicated life. That is, it made a little bit of a splash at the time. I was fortunate. It was the one book in my life that was published by a trade press, Basic Books. But the real impact on my career of that book happened a decade to 2 decades later, when I was invited by people who knew that book to join collective projects in the study of political leadership. The first project out of Oxford, the second project out of Yale, and those produced the majority of the chapters in my most recent book, Presidents on Political Ground. So there was a connection with the work I started in the early 1980s and the book that I published in 2016. My third book, which is The Liberals' Moment, the McGovern Insurgency, and the Identity Crisis of the Democratic Party. It's a very different project, but it too harked back to Berkeley. I had been, as I said, quite active politically in the late 1960s. The high point of the aspirations and illusions of the Democratic left. And by the mid-90s, after Icons of Democracy was published, I began to notice that there were tons of books by political scientists and historians investigating the rise of conservatism in America, while hardly anybody was asking whatever happened to American liberalism, particularly from the seeming heights and dreams of the late 60s to the tepid centrist liberalism then so clearly exemplified by President Bill Clinton, and later exemplified by other figures up until Barack Obama. So where had that come from? What had happened to my side of the political spectrum over that quarter of a century? And again, I went looking for the roots, and I found that the obvious place to study for both the most spectacular success and the most catastrophic fall of the progressive left was the McGovern campaign of 1972. that became my next book subject. And one of the things that made it easy was that nobody had written on that campaign since the 1970s, and no one had ever written an analytical study by a professional political scientist or historian for that matter. And the McGovern book, which took me much shorter time, really 8 years instead of 10, was, in retrospect, the most fun I've ever had as a scholar. First of all, it got me to do far more archival work than I had ever done. Fortunately for me, I was not far away from the McGovern papers, which are housed at Princeton. So 2.5 hour drive, and I could make the trip not infrequently. Loved poking around in archives and finding odd objects. Once even I found something scrawled in on the back of a hotel envelope in the handwriting of George McGovern. Furious, reacting with great fury when on national television, George Meany, the president of the AFL-CIO, had called him a sympathizer with communism. The archival part of the McGovern book was a blast. But there was something even more enjoyable, which was that this was the first, and sadly the only time, that I engaged in extensive interviewing. I got some training from people at the university who do oral history, and a longtime friend and historian, and bought an expensive tape recorder, and ended up conducting interviews with nearly 50 participants in the events of 1962. Most of them in the McGovern campaign, some of them people on the other sides, and some of them quite hostile to the McGovern campaign. It allowed me, through direct person-to-person interviews or sometimes phone interviews, to deal with and record the observations and memories of some obscure figures and some famous figures. For example, I did 3 interviews with Gary Hart, former US Senator and presidential candidate. But the greatest pleasure of all was that I ended up doing 3 interviews with George McGovern. Moreover, I met with him several other times, and on the 2 occasions that he spoke on our campus, I was the person who introduced him. I very much mourned his death, although I was invited to write a kind of eulogistic memory of him by the New York Times. So I had a great time interviewing McGovern. I came to dearly love the man, and also to see through my research his not insubstantial flaws. I sent him a copy of the book when it was published, and he got back to me very quickly and said in a great ambiguous comment, "It's an honest book." So I don't know how much he liked it, given that there was a lot of criticism in it. But he did say it was an honest book. And I was trying to avoid hagiography. And I think I did so. One of my favorite memories, also in terms of McGovern, was that I had the experience of having the presidential candidate of the Democratic Party of 1972 making me lunch in his vacation home in Montana, where I had gone to interview him. So I won't talk about my final book, because if we have time, we can say a little bit about that. But I do want to say, and I'm afraid I'm taking a little too much time, about the parts of my career that I ascribe to fortune rather than to choice. And I have to tell 3 short stories to do that. And the first story is how I came to Albany. The story takes place in the winter of 1978, when I was in my 4th year at the University of Texas at Austin, when I got a phone call from Charlie Tarleton, who was then the chair of our Department of Political Theorists, asking me if I wanted to come to Albany for an interview. And I had no idea there was a position. I had no particular interest in coming to Albany. But I wasn't really happy at the University of Texas. I love the city of Austin. It's a great place. It's one of the best places to live in America, but I didn't like the University of Texas at Austin. And I didn't particularly like the Department of Government, of which I was a member. The university was already then monstrously large, with a student population of more than 40,000 students. It's much larger now. The government department, commensurately, was very large, over 40 faculty members. It was a pretty cold, hierarchical, and somewhat alienating department. And while I had good friends among some of the junior faculty, really had almost no relationships with senior faculty, with one exception, and he was himself an outsider in the department. My friends were mostly political theorists, 3 terrific young theorists, all of whom would leave within 3 years. One of them, Bill Galston, who's a quite prominent figure in American political life as well as academia. So I was not exactly happy where I was. And there were personal reasons as well. And the one that I think most drove me and most mattered to me was that at that time my son Nick was 1.5 years old, and I had seen firsthand the macho political culture and social culture of Texas and how it socialized boys. And I didn't want to raise my son in that environment. So I came for an interview. I had nothing to lose. I had a job. And when I arrived, it was February in Albany. And you can imagine what it looked like. There was snow covering the ground. The sky was gray. The air was bitterly cold. It was very bleak. But I got a warm reception from the department, particularly 3 individuals who would be the people that really drew me to come to Albany. One was Charlie Tarleton, the other was Jack Gannell, and the third was Peter Cox, an IR scholar who sadly would not get tenure and leave a few years later, but became a longtime friend. I felt that, unlike Texas, this could be a home for me. This could be a place where I had simpatico colleagues. I had senior faculty who would be mentors and supporters. And you would not feel the uncertainty and alienation that I was feeling at Texas. So I made a move, came here with my ex-wife in the summer of 1978, and of course my young son, and have never regretted the change. The second story I'm going to talk about is the genesis of spectacle. And this too was something unexpected. At an APSA conference, sometime I think it was 1985, I was approached by a political scientist that I had never met, Michael Nelson. Nelson had recently published an edited volume called The Presidency and the Political System, which had been, in its first edition, great success. And what he approached me about was that he wanted me, for reasons I've never really known, to write a chapter for the second edition on presidents and the public. may have come because I published something on that subject a few years earlier. It got some attention, but I'm never really sure. And he had no idea what he was going to get from me because I had no idea what I was going to do. Well, back when I'd been at Texas, I had hung out with theory graduate students. And a couple of them had encouraged me to read some of the French writers who were writing about spectacle. Above all, Roland Barthes, who I talk about in the piece. And so as I thought about what I wanted to write, I realized that I really wanted to play with the idea of the presidency as a spectacle. Originally, it was kind of a half tongue-in-cheek political essay. So I developed the conceptual argument, and I picked the most relevant and recent historical examples, starting with the Kennedy presidency, and going up to and including Ronald Reagan. And the second edition of the book was published in Reagan's final year in the White House, 1988. Nelson's The Presidency and the Political System volume, which is, to my knowledge, the single most widely assigned book in the field of presidency studies, is now in its 12th edition. And I have updated and revised my spectral article every time from 1988 until the most recent edition, where I was writing less than a year ago about the spectacle of the Trump presidency. So it's an article I've been writing and fiddling with and changing from 1988 to 2020. And it is, from many different indications, the best known thing that I've ever written. Which brings me to the third story. And this story might be titled, How Did I Become a Textbook Author? This is the strangest story of all. One summer in the late 1980s, I went on a camping trip with two close friends, Ray Seidelman, who had taught in our department from 1979 to 1982 before departing for Sarah Lawrence College and had become a very close friend, and Todd Swanstrom, who some of our department remember, who taught here from 1982 to 2001. We went to the Catskills and we walked up a steep hill in the Catskills. And as we got close to the top of this mountain, it began to pour. When we got to the top of the mountain, everything was a sea of mud. We said, to hell with camping. We're not going to sleep in the mud. And we made a plan. We would climb down the mountain. We would look for a liquor store and buy some booze. And we would rent a cheap motel. And since it was still raining hard, we would batten down for the night. We bought the booze. We found a cheap motel. We drank the booze, and a rambling, half-drunken conversation began, which, for some odd reason, touched upon the theme of how much all of us disliked the existing textbooks about American politics for intro courses. How bland they were, how conventional they were, how unchallenging to students they were. And one of us, I don't remember who, it was a pretty hazy conversation, said, why don't we write a textbook? Well, out of that half-drunken conversation came a real plan. And within a year, we had 4 major textbook publishers bidding for our book project. We signed with one of them, Houghton Mifflin Company, and got for academics in those years a hefty advance payment. Certainly the largest I would ever get in my academic career. We produced a book called The Democratic Debate, a thematic book on American politics. And Todd came up with the idea for a companion volume, a reader, an anthology of articles by others, called Debating Democracy. Note the similar titles. We wanted a hook that would remind people that these two books went neatly together. We produced 6 editions of the textbook and 7 editions of the reader. So again, this project hatched in a bizarre conversation with alcohol in the late 80s, would occupy at least Todd and myself for almost the next 20 years periodically. Sadly, in one of the great pains of my life, Ray Seidelman died of cancer at the age of 56, and I lost my closest friend. But we found another author to take his place, although not equaling his contribution in quality. So that's how I became a textbook author. All of these events were not things that I initiated, not things that I planned. Time is running short. I had planned to talk about my teaching at Albany, especially 101, but I want to hold back on that. I just want to end with one anecdote about my early career as a teacher. While I was writing my doctoral dissertation and had really almost no source of income, I got an adjunct position from a junior college in Marin County, which, if you're not familiar with California, lies just across the Golden Gate Bridge from San Francisco. The topic of the course they asked me to teach was the history of political theory. The location was San Quentin Prison, a maximum security prison. In fact, the most notorious prison in the California prison system. A prison, by the way, that lies on a lonely peninsula sticking out in San Francisco Bay, one of the most grim, old-fashioned prisons imaginable in American life. So I designed and taught a course. Class of about 25, about half of them white, about half of them black. The whites mostly conservatives, the blacks mostly revolutionaries. It was quite a class. The class was memorable. I had a great time. And in fact, several of the students were quite extraordinarily smart and well-read. But it was a special class. It was different than anything else one would ever teach. For example, the guards had said when I first came there, never turn out the lights to show a film. Because if you do, someone, not you, but someone is going to get stabbed in the dark. So this was a place where underneath the educational context, there were some seething conflicts, particularly between black and white. In any case, I assigned my first paper in this history of political theory. Students had to write a short paper on Plato's Republic. And when I took the papers home and started reading them, I quickly saw that about half of them were obviously plagiarized. And my first thought is, I'm going to go in next week, this was a once-a-week class, and say, you can't do this. I was going to chastise them for plagiarism. And then I thought, these guys are here for armed robbery. Several of them committed murder and I'm going to call them out for plagiarism? So I laughed. I went in, I said, this is plagiarism. You can't do it. You got to write the paper over. And left it at that. I would choose students out for plagiarism on a college campus, but not in a maximum security prison. Anyway, I've loved my teaching career. I do have one regret, which the old timers may best understand, which is that in some ways the undergraduates were more of a pleasure to teach in the early years because they were more willing to read than the current internet generation. The favorite course I taught in my first years with some great students was called Insiders and Outsiders in American Politics. I signed several really long books, from the autobiography of Malcolm X to Moby Dick. And the students read those books and we had great conversations. And that's not something I think I could pull off these days. In any case, I might say more about my teaching career and among other things, why I enjoyed 101, unlike so many colleagues. But I'll leave it at that. And I do want to leave time if people have questions about my career or would like to talk about the piece on the presidency and spectacle. I'd love to hear it.